Hello, and welcome back to the Video Essay Podcast, a show featuring conversations with leading practitioners of videographic criticism. I'm your host, Will DeGravio, and on today's show, I sit down with Ian Garwood, a scholar at the University of Glasgow and one of the forum's leading practitioners. Ian and I discuss his innovative, award-winning project, Indy Vinyl, and Jessica McGoff's video essay, My Mulholland, which was published as part of the video essay series, Once Upon a Screen. Before we get to my conversation with Ian, I just want to thank the listeners out there for your continued loyalty and support of the podcast. I know it's been many weeks since the last episode. I recently, as some of you may know, moved to New York City, where I am now living. It has been wonderful and fun and really the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. So I'm just now getting fully settled here, and now that I get more comfortable, I'll hopefully be bringing you more podcast episodes in the future. And if you are in the New York City area and know of any exciting things going on or would like to meet up for a drink at some point or anything, please do let me know. I would love to join any video essay community or film community here in New York City. As always, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at The Video Essay. You can find more information about the show and its new sister podcast on your screen at thevideoessay.com. You can also find us on Facebook. And more recently, please consider subscribing to the Video Essay Podcast on YouTube. All of the past episodes and other show-related content are now on YouTube, and I have some plans for the YouTube channel going forward. So please consider giving me a subscribe there. And you can also support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/thevideoessay. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with the great Ian Garwood. I am now incredibly pleased to be joined by someone who really needs no introduction. If you have ever been on Video Essay Twitter, as I believe Kevin B. Lee recently referred to it, or have been in any Facebook group on videographic criticism, or just been in audiovisual C, you will have seen the work of one Ian Garwood, who is a senior lecturer in film and television studies at the University of Glasgow. Ian, you and I have been planning to sit down here for months and months, and we are finally doing it. Welcome to the Video Essay Podcast. It's so good to have you here.
Well, thanks very much, Will. Yeah, it's great to be here. It's a real honor, actually, to be invited to talk to you. And yeah, as you say, it has been a while since we tried to set this up. So really glad to be here. And I'm really grateful for all the things you've been doing as well on the podcast, but all the other work you do associated with it. So I'm really glad to be a part of that.
Well, thank you. And thank you also for your support of the podcast and always retweeting and sharing and participating in the various projects that are going on. I think that's what makes the podcast worth doing for people like me, is, getting to watch all of the great stuff that listeners make, and your work has taught me so much. So I'm really excited to be sitting down here to talk about it. And my first question for you is, what is your origin story? I find, for some reason, I had just assumed that you had gone to the video camp at Middlebury College, but I don't think that's true. And so I have no clue how you were first introduced to videographic criticism, what inspired you to begin creating video essays. Walk us through how you started doing this.
Actually, you've unwittingly touched a bit of a nerve there, actually, because that's one of my biggest regrets, not to have been to the Middlebury College video camp. I mean, it just sounds like this idyllic experience, and everyone that's been there that I've talked to describes it like that, and it just never was kind of a possibility, really, in terms of I had kind of two young kids, and I couldn't get away for that amount of time in the summer, even if I'd been successful in going to it. So that's one of my regrets. But in terms of where it started for me, I think maybe my story is fairly familiar in terms of the experience of, certainly, of kind of academics who are kind of established film studies academics and have been for a while, like me, in the sense that I was really introduced to the video essay form through the sort of the viral videos of like Every Frame a Painting and Kevin B. Lee, around that sort of 2010 time, because I was interested in them myself and I picked up on them myself, but also because my students were increasingly watching these things and talking about them. So there was that kind of influence, which I know is familiar for a lot of us. And then the other influence was actually Cary Grant, really, and all the work she did to promote the form in academia. And I was really inspired by that. And that's really what prompted me to think I can teach video essays in my courses. And so I suppose if there's a kind of slight spin on the origin story, is that it's really the teaching context that's been influential to me. So the first video essay I made was explicitly made as a teaching tool. It was a video essay on Hoagy Carmichael, who was a real life musician who played a sort of barroom pianist figure in lots of classic Hollywood melodramas in the 40s and 50s. And I made that video to learn how to make them and also to produce a model for students on the course that I was going to teach the next year, a video essay course. So really, that was my ambition at the time, was to think about how I could use video essays in teaching rather than really thinking of it as a kind of means of research. I suppose that came out of my experience. So I've been working at University of Glasgow for 20 years now. And the course that we offer, the undergraduate program anyway, is primarily theoretical and critical, but we do offer a few production courses as well. And one thing that we've always tried to do on the courses is to try and make sure there's a critical element to the production courses as well. And for some reason, I don't really know why, I was often the person, the kind of the academic link to the practical courses. And I puzzled for a number of years over how to kind of get that critical element into the practical courses. Not particularly successfully, I don't think, really. So actually the idea of making video essays in the context of our degree program seemed like the perfect way of mixing sort of theory and practice together. It just seemed the ideal form. So they were the motivations really that led me to trying to make them myself. And then the reason I've kind of kept making them and it's become more of a research activity as well, I suppose, again, I really have to thank Cary Grant a lot for the support she gave me. Her reaction to the first video I made was, really helpful to me. And she encouraged me to reflect on it in one of the early editions of In Transition. And so it's kind of gone on from there, really.
I love that origin story. Thank you for sharing it, because I think when I watch your work, obviously there is the rigorous research, the critical lens through it, but so much of your work, as I said, teaches me and your audience so many things. And one feels that teaching origin in your work. But when was it that you talked about the encouragement of Cary Grant, which, I count myself as among the people who have been encouraged by Katie and would not be doing a lot of things that I'm doing without her. Do you remember when it was that you realized, oh, this is what I want to use as a form of research? And when did that come?
Well, it was partly due to the encouragement that I had after doing the Hoagy Carmichael video, and because I was asked to reflect on the video in Transition, which is obviously an academic journal which is publishing research, it kind of forced me or encouraged me to think of what I'd done as research. So I suppose that was definitely part of it. And then the next time I made a video was the place of voiceover in audiovisual film and TV criticism, catchiest title ever. And so then that the genesis of that was firstly as part of a presentation at the Screen conference. So Screen is kind of a big sort of film and TV studies conference, as people in academia will know, and it's actually run out of University of Glasgow. So, but again, I must say it was Cary Grant that invited me onto the panel to do that, and so I made basically the first half of that video for the Screen conference. So clearly that's a conference where you're presenting your research, and so that I think it just developed really from the kind of the reception of the Hoagie Carmichael video. Made me think, okay, this is going to be really useful for teaching, and it certainly has sort of given me a new lease of life in terms of the teaching that I've been doing over the last 6 or 7 years, I guess. But then I thought, actually, I can also kind of publish videos as part of my research portfolio, and it's just gradually sort of gathered a head of steam since then, but actually quite gradually. So it's only really in the last year or so that I've really started being a lot more productive in terms of the amount of videos I may make. I suppose I had until recently had an idea that really what I'm going to be doing is using my video essays in teaching, and then maybe occasionally kind of producing my own videos, which might end up being kind of part of my research portfolio. But it wasn't the focus in the early years, certainly.
You mentioned the place of voiceover in academic audiovisual film and television criticism, which is the video essay that I was going to ask you about next. So this video, I've seen Jason Mattel screen for people many times. So I first watched it at Middlebury College and had seen it multiple times really before I, decided that I wanted to kind of join the video essay world and really knew who you were. And I would say if I was to put together like a list of, the most influential video essays or video essays that I think, everyone should watch right when they're being introduced to the forum, this video would be on the list. And I know for a fact, we talked about Video Camp, that's one of the video essays that is screened at Video Camp for people who are getting first introduced to the forum. My first question would be, walk us through the creation of that video. How did you get the idea? But could you also discuss, and the reason I ask this is because it's one of many examples of works that you've made that analyze and reflect on the practice of videographic criticism itself. And what is it that draws you to reflect on the form in this way?
Yeah, I think actually you got the title completely right. I think I got my own title wrong. I missed out the word academic when I said it, I think. So that particular video, the voiceover video, one of the impetus for it was to just do a kind of self-critique. So part of the reason that I'm interested in thinking through what the form can do is because I'm interested in trying to do it better myself, I suppose. So sort of selfishly, that is one of the reasons I'm trying to work these ideas through. But of course, I could do that and then not show it to anyone if it was really just for kind of self-improvement. So I do then make the decision to often put these videos online as well. So I suppose one thing is, again, going back to the sort of the idea of teaching being really important, that I feel that often I make these videos with teaching in mind, and a lot of the teaching I do around audiovisual criticism is around the form of audiovisual criticism. So it makes sense then that the videos are about that topic, and they're very sort of metacritical in that way. The other kind of influence, I suppose, is I suppose I'm quite self-conscious about the different forms that I use in my video work, and maybe that's something we'll come on to talk about more later. Partly because, as I said, until recently, I guess I had an impression of myself as someone who wouldn't make that many video essays. So because I had that impression of myself, I thought, well, each time I make one, I had better make it in a different style. And so that's kind of definitely was a conscious decision until recently, at least, that I would try and make the most of my experience making the video essays by not trying to do the same thing each time. So because I'm self-conscious about the form and the way I use it, I think it probably then makes sense that I'm kind of quite critically reflective about what the form can do, and so that some of my videos end up being metacritical because of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And I hope everyone listening to this conversation right now hears what Ian is saying. Here we have a prolific video essayist, one of the best, talking about how he did not think he would be that way. And I think, there's definitely a lesson in there and some words of encouragement.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the drivers behind the voiceover video definitely was for me to reflect back on the voiceover I delivered for the Hoagie Carmichael video, which kind of, I think everyone no one, I don't think, likes the sound of their voice. But I certainly felt there was room for improvement in terms of the way I kind of delivered the voiceover and the way I scripted things as well. So yeah, really that video, there was a lot of the impetus for it was being self-critical and trying to work out how to do it better in the future, or to find other ways of doing this kind of research in this format, potentially without using voiceover. So it was a way of kind of trying to work out what the position and value of voiceover was in the field, looking at lots of different examples, but partly so I could think about what I would do with kind of voiceover in the future. And actually what I decided to do with voiceover was not to use it very much at all in future work. So it was almost as if I'd stymied myself in some way by kind of making this very self-conscious video about voiceover and thinking quite carefully about the value of using it, the limits of using it. I kind of talked myself out of using it myself until quite recently.
One of the things you talk about in that video is just the dominance of male voices in audiovisual criticism, and just like in every other aspect of society, video essays are no different. But one of the things that I think about when I think about your video and in pointing that out is when you and others make these types of video essays, it's also not only is it being, self-reflective, not only is it giving other audiovisual essayists and consumers of audiovisual essayists things to think about as far as the form, but it's also, I think, making the case for the form itself, and particularly towards those who might want to delegitimize it or not view it as scholarly, as was the subject of the recent issue of The Cinephiles and my conversation with Tracy Cox-Stanton and Alison Dufresne. And it seems to me that your voice also shows the importance of actually thinking through all the different components of an audiovisual essay. Each element is worthy of critique and analyzing, and there's an art to this, and there's more than just there's a lot that goes into someone reading a script or annotating a video, right? And I think in a way you're recognizing that for being important. And in that I feel your expertise as a scholar of music and of sound, because I think that there are people who would say, oh, well, writing is harder, writing is better, writing is what we should focus on. But you're actually saying, no, there's a lot behind the voice and the voiceover that we need to unpack and look at.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I find it quite funny that my kind of greatest hit, in a way, is a 20-minute video about such a niche topic. In a way, but that certainly was one of the intentions, was to value the form and to explore the possibilities of the form. And I suppose one thing that I feel about my sort of metacritical videos is that I don't think they're very theoretical, actually, and I'm not a very theoretical person, actually. I like to think of them as quite practical forms of self-reflection. So really, I'm looking to see how things have been done and then reflecting from that position, really. So then in that voiceover video, I do then kind of suggest some ways that the use of voiceover could be developed, and offer some hopes for the future, I suppose. But it's very much based on kind of a practical reflection on what's actually being done at the moment.
One of the things that SCMS does that I really enjoy and that I've recently started to go back is they do these interviews with pioneers in film studies and in TV studies, and they're on Vimeo. I forget exactly what they're called. They have a name to them. And it's really interesting to kind of go back and watch the development of film studies. But one of the things that I really love about video essays and videographic criticism in this community is that there are so many works like yours that are tracking this development in real time and reflecting on it. And that's not to say that film studies did not have that in written forms. Of course it did. But it's fun to feel like, we are living through so many of these debates right now, and that they're happening in such a meta way, and that we have the internet and that we can do things online. And in that vein, you recently made a series of video lectures that Kevin B. Lee called, and I'm going to quote Kevin here, truly inspired examples of lectures as video essays or vice versa that I've seen this year. I watched them with joy and awe. Now, I will link to all of these video essays, and you generously agreed to reflect on them in Notes on Videographic Criticism a few weeks or months ago. Time runs. I don't know what time is anymore. I hadn't previously thought of your lectures as video essays per se, in the way that Kevin describes. And I'm wondering, do you think that they are video essays? And was that your intention when you were making them, or were they for you just an exercise in, as you said, teaching and video lectures?
Well, first of all, I was just so pleased to see Kevin saying that. It was like, I was really very kind of chuffed, to use an academic word. I suppose the primary purpose was as elements of my teaching, and so just to give a bit of context to them, I suppose they were made. I was doing the last 3 weeks of a co-taught course, a postgraduate course called Advanced Topics in Film Studies, and the first 2 blocks of teaching had been done by colleagues on quite disparate topics. So one colleague had done a block on notions of film history. Another colleague had done a block on ideas of cosmopolitanism and transnationalism and national cinemas. My brief really was to do a block on audiovisual film criticism, but to try and tie it into the other two blocks. So, it was kind of it was an interesting intellectual and exercise and teaching exercise to try and find links between my block and the other two blocks. So I made them. I thought it would be a good idea to make them, as the topic was audiovisual film criticism. Why not make these to go alongside the teaching? And I deliberately made each of them in a different style because it was an option for the students to make video essays on the course. So I wanted to kind of showcase some of the different styles they could potentially use. So all of that was kind of a sort of the teaching purpose of them. So I don't know if I would call them video essays. I know that I wouldn't call them lectures, even though they do have that teaching context, because the way I actually released them was, rather than kind of releasing them a good time before that week's topic, I actually released them within the week in which I was teaching that topic. So the idea of them really was, it was almost as if I was like the student, sort of just trying to get to grips with the material as you're going along, and then I did a videographic response to that material. So they weren't kind of lectures in the sense that they were setting up the ideas that the kind of students had to know in order to kind of get through the reading and the viewing for that week. So they're more kind of working in the flow, which I know is a phrase that you like, borrowed from Cary Grant. That was a kind of the idea behind them. So they're not lectures in a traditional sense, I don't think. Whether or not I would call them video essays, I don't know. I mean, it's such a kind of a big tent term, obviously, the video essay. Certainly, if you want to, you can call it a video essay if you like. So, but I think it's quite interesting to think about what they are, because, as I say, I don't think they're just video lectures. I'm not sure they're not video essays in the sense that they're kind of pursuing a particular research topic and kind of coming to a kind of particularly formed argument about something. So that was the impetus behind those. So there was a strong teaching impetus, but then I decided to put them online, and as soon as they go online outside of the classroom context, then I think they do turn into something else inevitably, actually. And going back to what you said about the kind of the really kind of cool thing about audiovisual criticism is that you can release things, reflections on the form that kind of keep track of how the form is growing. You can just release them and keep track of things in real time. That was definitely something that I hope these videos do as well. And it really is one of the kind of advantages to me of audiovisual criticism, is the ability just to publish things when I want to, rather than sort of getting kind of caught up in the slow kind of wheels of academic publishing. So I decided to put them online, and as soon as I do that, they're not just teaching tools anymore. They're out there in the world, for other people to see and relate to. And the final point in terms of keeping track of developments, all of the videos were really inspired by the Cine Files special edition on the scholarly video essay. So I was really kind of very happy that came out just before Christmas, or whenever it came out. I've lost track of time now. I think it was just after Christmas, wasn't it? It came out, and it was really great. It came out that time, and I really did want to make sure I was kind of using the thinking in that special issue in my teaching. So I was really happy that I could kind of bring that into the videos.
Well, we're going to get back to the cinephiles, and we're going to get back to working in the flow in a second. I completely agree. And this, I was going to say the same thing, that, and you said it better than I would have said it, that once these videos leave the classroom, they become something else. And I think it's that moment when they leave that you could make the argument that they become video essays or videographic criticism. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it kind of ties back to this thing that I actually may have said when I spoke to your class for the first time, but it's something I've said a couple times that maybe I've stolen from someone else too, is that you can make the argument that a video essay, and this is a little tongue in cheek, but a video essay isn't a video essay until it's uploaded online somewhere publicly. Obviously there are caveats. There are DVD extras and ones that screen at film festivals, and of course those count. So it's not. I'm not making a hard statement. But I think there's some truth there that I think is worth unpacking, and perhaps. I don't know. I'm going to chew on that a little bit more. But if anyone has any thoughts, let me know. But the core point, I guess, of your videos, or one of them is, or the thing people should know about them, is that it reappropriates a lot of footage and video of other videographic critics. I know I'm in there in one of the videos, my conversation with John Gibbs, and you're releasing these sparked an interesting conversation about sort of the ethics of appropriating this video. And you reached out to me, and you reached out to, I think, pretty much everyone to just seek permission to appropriate us in this way. As speaking just for myself, you did not need to ask my permission. I appreciate it, and I would have been fine with it either way, because I think once the podcast goes out there, it's kind of fair game. But you had a great line that has been rattling around my head in the reflection you wrote, which is that there's a difference between remixing Cary Grant and remixing Catherine Grant. And I think there's a lot of truth there, but I'm wondering if you could just explain to the listeners what that difference is for you.
There's a couple of differences. I think one is it just is a different experience to be co-opting footage of people that you either know, as in the case of Catherine Grant, or that you're aware of because you're all part of the same academic community or kind of video essay making community, than messing around with footage from Cary Grant, Hollywood star, who obviously is long gone, and has made his films in the knowledge that they're there, for the public to consume. I think there is sort of just in my mind, there's something kind of seemingly different about appropriating footage of kind of non-professional kind of actors for my own work, with the added element of the sort of like maybe personally knowing them or being aware of them. But actually, I think one of the point I was making in the reflection that you asked me to write was, in the end, I think it is ethical to make use of those images and those voices, and the comparison would be, I wouldn't think twice about quoting the same people if they'd kind of written an article about videographic criticism, and I was writing an article about it. You wouldn't kind of seek permission every time you quoted someone in a written article. So really, it shouldn't be anything different when you're kind of using bodies and voices in the act of quotation, but it does feel different to me because of the embodied nature of it. And so I think obviously the embodied nature of audiovisual film criticism is one of its most distinctive features, and one of the kind of features that are, is something that we're all trying to exploit. It's one of the real big attractions of this form. But it does also mean it's a kind of a different experience working with bodies and voices rather than working with words on the page. Does seem to be a qualitatively different experience. I'm not sure. It's something, considering I wrote that reflection for you, I should have thought through more, really. But that's my thoughts at the moment anyway.
Well, no, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you. And I think, in a way, you could tie this to the power of the form that we're working with, in that it is a different experience to see and hear someone than it is to read a quote. Like, it just is different. And, pretending otherwise would be dishonest. And also, obviously you would never do this, but the ways that you could harm or slander or hurt Cary Grant, I don't think you could really do that. I mean, you probably could, but it would be much harder to do that than to really misrepresent a scholar who you are remixing, or to present them in a way that's unfavorable, or to make them feel uncomfortable, or whatever, go down the list. And it's very different, and the image and sound is more powerful in this context than words a lot of the time, and so pretending that's not there would be dishonest to yourself, to everyone else, and to the form that we're working with.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And I think I make life easy for myself, or at the moment so far, because the only ways I've ever used the voices of other kind of people making video essays is hopefully in a positive way, never in a way which is intended to kind of be destructive or even actually to contradict the kind of the work or the views that are being proposed by other people. There has also to be room, obviously, for kind of disagreement as well. So I think that would be a really kind of interesting test case. What would happen, if there was a kind of a position that I really wanted to take issue with. I think maybe I would feel more comfortable about doing that in a written article than I would in terms of you actually using their kind of faces and voices of the people that I'm arguing against in a video. But I haven't actually had to deal with that dilemma as yet.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I never thought of it, but it definitely just feels more confrontational. It feels like I don't know, like like it would be turned into some type of expose, or you could just imagine how it would then start to feel like, I don't know, something made by like a tabloid, or I don't know. It's interesting. It would depend on the context, of course, but I know what you mean.
And I suppose there as well, the difference between dealing with thoughts that people are expressing on video and dealing with thoughts that people have expressed in writing is that in writing, writers have a chance to kind of hide behind their words in a way, and the words are kind of the final product, at the end of a process of thinking, whereas even if you're very carefully prepared in terms of what you want to say on video, there's all sorts of other things going on. You might stumble over your words. You might not actually, your body language might not be as you really want it to be. So they're all other additional factors, I think, that make the kind of the quotation of bodies and voices a slightly trickier proposition.
Absolutely. One of the writer, Fran Lebowitz, has a very famous case of writer's block. She hasn't written anything in like 40 or 50 years, whatever, but she's made the documentary about her by Martin Scorsese is called Public Speaking, and that's how she makes her money. And she said that people often say to her, well, why don't you just write down your lectures and that can become your next book? And she said, transcribe any conversation with someone and then read it. And I'll tell you, that's not writing. That's not what writing is. And I think the same principle applies here. I hope no one is holding anything I say on this podcast or in a live Q&A or anything as gospel. So I think it's an important point for sure. I want to learn more about your creative process, because we've touched on a couple of things here. One is that you've mentioned that it's been recently that you've been making a lot more videos. And I think that's definitely what I've come to associate with you is sometimes I'll wake up on a Saturday morning and Ian has a new creative, exciting video. And you've already mentioned Katie's great phrase that I steal, working in the flow, which we can add remixing Cary Grant is different than remixing Catherine Grant to the set of phrases that I've already stolen in multiple contexts. You often make videos, as we've already mentioned, in response to the work of others, in response to a thread on Twitter. You're very active on Twitter, and to just film criticism more generally. You made the video Mr. Grant's Dream House, which was in response to the call for video essays that this podcast, in partnership with the Cary Comes Home Festival and Charlotte Crofts, put out. Could you just discuss in general terms how ideas form in your head, and how you look for inspiration for videos, and how you decide when to kind of wet your feet in things that are going online? Because it seems to me that's what I associate with not all of your work, obviously, but much of what you do in your work.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying that, I think it is a more recent attitude that I've adopted. It coincides with the pandemic to a certain extent, but also I think just working through the sort of my Indy Vinyl project, which I know we'll go on to talk about, as that's developed, I've definitely become much more open to working in the flow and to responding to things that are just happening in the moment. I think another element that's kind of encouraged that in me is becoming more active on social media, in particular Twitter, although I've been a bit quiet on Twitter recently, but it kind of comes and goes. But certainly I'm still looking at what's happening on Twitter. So I do try and be responsive to things that are happening out there, and that's why I feel like I'm working in such a kind of a lucky time, really, because there's such a sort of lively discussion about audiovisual criticism going on, especially over the last couple of years in public forum, and I think a lot of it is down to your work, Will, that it gives me so much to respond to. So I think I need it. I need that outside stimulus to be motivated to do things. So I think the call that you made for the Cary Grant videos for the Cary Grant Festival, themed around the idea of journeys, that's just a really good case in point. I'm not a Cary Grant scholar by any means. I would never have thought to have made anything about Cary Grant until you put that call out, and then as soon as you did, I thought, okay, what can I do? I don't know if you want a kind of more detailed kind of idea of the process. I could talk a little bit about the Mr. Grant's Dream House and how that developed.
Oh yes, I want to get I want a full picture, because I'm just interested in this portrait of the video essayist. Like, just to give you an example, like when you get an idea, does it just sit in your head for a little bit and you kind of start tinkering around up there, or is it late at night and you get the idea and you pull up Premiere and you start doing downloads, like, or does it vary project to project? Just how do you start a project and start working through what you're going to do?
Well, I think again it's changed in earlier years. I say earlier years as if I've been doing this for 30 years, but in sort of when I started 7 or 8 years ago, I think I made the prospect of making video essays seem like a big deal in my head. And so, as I said earlier, that's why I think I decided I had it in my mind I wasn't going to make many videos. So when it did come to making one, there was a long gestation period in terms of thinking about what it might be, and how it might develop. But over the last, say, 15 months or so, I have definitely changed my attitude, and now it is much more the case that if I have an idea, I try and kind of make time to implement it, and not worry too much about whether it will count as research, or anything like that, which I think is something I've heard Catherine Grant talk about as well, is really just to make things in the moment, and then maybe reflect on them in a more formalized context afterwards, but I don't do that with everything. So it is a case of getting an idea and then just trying to kind of develop it, and something that I increasingly do try and kind of say to the students that are making video essays is really not to hold on to the idea on paper for too long. So I think partly because at Glasgow most of what our students do is kind of writing about film and TV, and we do sort of teach them the importance of planning and things like that. A number of students are quite reluctant to sort of stop planning things and just kind of get into the editing software and just play around with their footage. So I'm nearly always encouraging students to get onto that stage quicker than they might want to, and so that's kind of an attitude I've tried to kind of follow myself, particularly recently as well. So so for Mr. Grant's Dream House, for example, your call was for the video essays to be around the theme of journeys in relation to Cary Grant, and so my immediate thought, as it always is, to think quite small, and so I was thinking, well, what's the smallest kind of journey I can envisage? And so I thought, well, how about just the journey of kind of going through a door from one room to another? So that was the idea, and then it's just a case of getting the footage together, looking at the kind of the films for moments where Cary Grant goes through a door, and then just harvesting the clips, getting them into the editing software, and playing around with them. So so once I get the idea, I do try and make things quite sort of intensively, not necessarily quickly, but certainly sort of try and put the hours in whilst the idea is fresh in my mind. Of course, there's always sort of the real life distractions which sometimes stop you from just kind of shutting yourself away for 4 days solid to finish these things. But that's definitely the kind of the attitude I try and have now, is trying to work on an idea quite intensively, and to get into the sort of editing phase as quickly as I can.
That makes a lot of sense. I love how you thought of the smallest possible journey. And I think there is something to that, of not thinking about everything as this large, big project idea, instead of just taking one little thought and kind of expanding it. And those are a lot of the video essays that I most love and enjoy, whether it's Ioannis Binotto or Ariel Vassar, is someone whose work I kind of see as similar to yours in a way. I don't know if you agree with that, but just in the sense that I feel like the two of you will often just drop these really fun, creative works that are dissimilar from one another in a really refreshing way, and I'm always surprised, and it's great. And this mix of playfulness with the form, but also a high level of analysis and clear knowledge of the subject matter. I don't know if you've noticed a kinship. That's what I want to bring up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I hadn't. I mean, I really admire his work, and it makes me want to watch it again now to see those links that you're making. I mean, in terms of the Mr. Grant's Dreamhouse video, I wouldn't make a claim for it having kind of high levels of analysis. That particular video, actually, hopefully it is fun. But one thing I would say about the process is that it was only by playing around with the footage in the editing software that I realized what wasn't working. So even though my kind of initial idea was just to have Cary Grant going through one door through to one room and then through to another, as I was actually making it, I thought it needs something else. This is actually going to be a bit tedious just to see him just going through doors the whole time. So the element that I added then was to have Cary Grant sort of witness himself doing something, ideally in each room. I never actually managed to get him doing something in every single room in the house, but in a lot of the rooms. So I added kind of moments of comic performance, quite famous moments of comic performance from some of his films that Cary Grant would witness as he was walking from door to door as well. So, but I wouldn't, if I just planned everything on paper, I wouldn't have kind of discovered so quickly that it needed that extra element. So it's good that you kind of sort of see what I'm doing as fun, because I mean that's part of the process, is to make it fun. So I saw that video in particular. It's really just like a jigsaw puzzle. Once I had my clips, it's like trying to work out how, what the best match between the different clips of him walking from door to door are. And then when I needed little moments of drama to kind of change the pace of it a little bit as well. So You can't do a jigsaw puzzle without having all the bits kind of laid out in front of you. So that's how I see the kind of the editing software, really.
You've touched on something very interesting, which is that you said that you would not say that Mr. Grant's Dreamhouse has rigorous analysis or a lot of analysis. And, obviously that I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think what's interesting now is then how can we use your video to then analyze Cary Grant and how we think about Cary Grant, and then how can we then it's sort of similar to that process that you said of make first and then reflect later, whether in a written article or in a podcast format like this. So let's reflect for a second. One of the questions so Ian participated in a live event that we held at the Cary Comes Home Festival, reflecting on these video essays that we made. That was a previous episode of this podcast, and it also exists as a live video, so folks can go listen to that as well or watch that. But one of the questions that I had in the lead up to that I don't think I actually asked in the live event, but that I'm very fascinated in, is I believe that Cary Grant, for some reason, and this is what we're going to talk about, or I'll ask you what you think, is a particularly suitable object for the study of videographic criticism. As a performer, as a person, there's something about him that I've seen many video essays, yours included, or I shouldn't say many, but more than I've seen about other performers, that seem to emphasize his movement, the way he moves, that are just concerned not as much with analysis, but just as much as putting him in the video essay itself and kind of seeing what happens. What are your thoughts on that, particularly as you look back on the video? Is there something about Cary Grant that makes him particularly suitable for the videographic critic?
Yeah, well, I think you're definitely onto something. And just what you said there, Will, Cary Grant has got such a distinctive performance style, I think definitely does reward close attention. And if one of the things that audiovisual film criticism is good at doing is kind of showing details which might otherwise kind of, not be seen outside of that kind of concentrated audiovisual container, then I think Cary Grant's performance style does reward that close attention. So both in terms of his physical performance, but also he's got a very distinctive voice, obviously, which is used in lots of different ways over his career as well. So I think that's one reason why you can see that Cary Grant is just a kind of a perfect subject really for audiovisual scrutiny in a way. I think also the fact that Cary Grant is a Hollywood star, and this is not so much a point about Cary Grant, it's more a point about, I guess, a continuity-based cinema like Hollywood cinema, is that, for my purposes, for what I was trying to do there, I was really working with the ingrained continuity in that style of filmmaking. And it really, it allowed me to make a kind of this fiction that Cary Grant was moving from film to film, room to room, but also film to film. My video had a flow, partly because that flow was already there in the kind of the original editing scheme of the films that I was harvesting. That kind of really, that commitment to continuity in that sort of Hollywood style, I think means that there's a kind of that's something that can lend its force to the criticism. I suppose that's Christian Keithley's point about video essays kind of borrowing the aesthetic force of the objects of study. It's a very kind of appealing aesthetic force that you're kind of drawing from that continuity-based kind of cinema, which you can either go along with, which is kind of what I did in my video, or if you want to resist it, if you want to kind of be in conflict with that, it gives you something kind of that's, because it's so kind of perfectly continuous in its own way, it makes it something that's actually you can very effectively kind of deconstruct and oppose in quite a kind of a strong and critical way, I think. So and actually, in terms of kind of me saying that my video I didn't think was particularly analytical, one of my hopes of it was that other people would take it on and maybe do something else that was a bit more overtly analytical with the video. So I kind of put a call out on Facebook and on Twitter, just saying if anyone wants to download my video and do whatever they want with it, please do so. And a couple of people have definitely done that. So Max Tolin and Rob Stone. So Rob Stone did did this wonderful kind of kaleidoscopic remix of Mr. Grant's Dream House. And Max Tolin did this really wonderful video letter called Better Homes Through Editing. And that's something he picked up on, is the kind of how kind of this continuity basis of Hollywood cinema really kind of lends itself to being kind of reworked through audiovisual criticism. So that's the general point. It's because Cary Grant was a star within that kind of cinema. I think that kind of makes him amenable for the audiovisual form. Another thing would be just the availability of the Cary Grant archive. So I mean, he made over 80 films, I think, nearly all of which are pretty easily available. So I mean, a lot of his early ones are just there on YouTube. So I didn't throw money at this project, but it was just from the subscriptions I have and just YouTube. It was easy enough to kind of find the material to work with. And that is, I think, that question, it's something that's taken up quite interestingly in a couple of the articles in the Cinephiles. It's okay for us to be playing with the archive and having fun with that, but obviously the archive privileges certain films over other films, and the Cary Grant films are not kind of neglected films, so they're easily available, and you need to be able to get hold of the footage to do anything with it, obviously. But having said all of that, in terms of him being kind of having a very distinctive performing persona, being part of a kind of a filmmaking system which is easily available, I think there's still some kind of enigma around Cary Grant. And I think one of there's been quite a lot of writing about the disparity between his public persona and his private persona. So there's still a sense there's a mystery to be solved with Cary Grant. And I suppose, again, that's one of the other kind of things that you want to do with audiovisual criticism, is to solve mysteries, and to kind of explore enigmas. So I think there are reasons why Cary Grant should be a really kind of rewarding star for audiovisual study. But I think your call really kind of brought out a lot of really great video essays on Cary Grant, and it kind of filled a gap as far as I could see. I mean, I did have a look around to see what was already out there, and there's a good sort of Sight and Sound, I think it's Sight and Sound or BFI video about Cary Grant's sort of slapstick performance style, but I couldn't actually find that many other video essays on Cary Grant. But now there's sort of 6 or 7 thanks to your call for them.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that analysis. And I think your point of the archive is well taken. I think that was definitely something that I have, become more aware of. I think I very much had the view like, on the internet now everything's available, everything's accessible. And, the more I've learned, the more I realized that's definitely not true. So it's definitely an important point. And I think one thing that Charlotte said during our live event, Charlotte Crofts, was that when she started this festival as part of an effort to show why Cary Grant should be a serious object of study. And I think the video essay is such a perfect means to explore Cary Grant, because to me that doesn't feel weird to take him as seriously as an object of study. But I think at the end of the day, he is, in many of his films, he has some serious performances, of course, but he is playful, he is fun, he's hilarious, he's handsome, he's all of these things. And so the way that the video essay balances the serious with those playful, fun things, it seems to me to be the perfect venue to explore someone like Cary Grant. And I think a video like yours, in the way that it's kind of super cutty in that, it's appropriating a lot of films and looking at we could call it a super cut to the way Cary Grant moves or walks or something, it shows to me what he brought to his films, right? It doesn't matter who the director is or who the studio is or the genre or the year per se. There are some continuities in what he brought to his work that situates, lends, will help someone who's conducting a serious analysis of Grant as a performer, but at the same time will make you laugh and smile and, fall in love with him all over again.
Yeah, and I mean, I do see that video as a kind of resource, I suppose, for kind of further research. And I've already actually produced another version of that where I did a kind of audio remix, of it, which was trying to just offer another critical perspective, I suppose, on that material. And yeah, as I say, I was delighted to see Max Tolin and Rob Stone kind of take it on as well. And so, yeah, if anyone just wants to kind of pick it up and go with it, I'd really be interested to see what people do with that kind of source material.
My final question for you before we move on to Indy Vinyl, and that is, we've mentioned a couple of times the latest issue of the Cinephiles. You wrote one of my favorite pieces that's included as part of that issue, in which you analyzed all of the creator statements published alongside works in transition. I learned a lot from your piece. I appreciated the phrase, the acceptance of ambiguity, that you used to describe the ethos of the creative process in a way. I'm very interested in thinking about how we write about videographic criticism. That's something I've said a couple of times, and I don't necessarily mean in a self-reflective way, in chronicling the creative process or talking about why you wanted to make a video essay. I'm interested in that, but that's not what I'm referring to here. The ambiguity that you identify, and this kind of relates to what we were just talking about with Mr. Grant's Dream House. It makes it clear that we should be writing more about videographic criticism, interpreting the works of videographic critics and scholars and filmmakers in the same way that we write about any other work of art. And I'm not saying that I'm original in advocating for this. A lot of people have mentioned this. Did writing this essay and going through the creator statements, did it change how you viewed and thought about the work of others and the role that writing should play more generally in the videographic discourse?
I think because the piece I wrote was a survey piece and I was looking for general patterns in terms of the ways that creators wrote about the work that was published in Transition. Because I was looking for those general patterns, it wasn't so much a case I kind of had insights into particular individual work through the process of writing that article. But having said that, I do think the kind of creator statements in Transition and also the peer reviews are really useful resources, just for the reason that you say, actually, in terms of kind of having a written discourse around the work. And okay, the creator statements might tend to be obviously self-reflexive about the process and what they're doing, but the peer reviews are kind of obviously looking from an external perspective and reviewing the work with In Transition's editorial guidelines in mind, so that they're not like kind of reviews that you would get in the newspaper of the work, but they're still evaluative reviews. So I think they're really kind of useful resources, and it goes to the point that I suppose, one of the justifications of audiovisual criticism is that the audiovisual form can yield insights that other forms can't in the same way. So, writing is a critical form as well. So it follows that writing can do things that audiovisual criticism can't do so easily as well. So I don't think there should be a kind of a big schism or kind of conflict between the idea of writing and the idea of kind of doing audiovisual criticism. And writing, that's about individual pieces of works can be obviously really useful in terms of illuminating aspects of the work, kind of just trying to kind of encourage other people to appreciate the value of the work as well. One thing that when I teach video essay courses, I always get students to do is to watch as many video essays as they can. And this year, I actually formalised that to get every week the students had to kind of write a kind of, a 200 words on a particular video essay that they'd chosen. So if we were kind of concentrating on sound, for that week, they would have to search out a video essay they thought was really interesting in terms of sound, and then just write 200 words on why they thought it was interesting. And I thought that was hopefully a useful exercise for the students, but it also made me think it would be kind of nice for those kind of reviews to be more out there in public as well. So it's obviously you on your podcast, you always have this kind of, as we'll come to later, you invite the people you're talking to talk about a video essay that they really kind of admire. So I think again you're contributing to that process of kind of getting a reviewing culture around video essays going. I suppose when video essays get selected and packaged for festivals and things like that, that's another opportunity for the work to be reviewed in the same way as a kind of a sort of a work of art would be. And I think that's a really kind of positive development.
To transition here to Indy Vinyl, a project that features the written word and the sounds and images. Your Indy Vinyl project, I know I, like many others, had it on my Sight and Sound list of the best video essays or video essay projects of 2020. I want to preface this segment by saying that your project is so rich and varied that we will not be able to cover everything in this interview, but please give us an introduction to the project. And you have a beautiful long reflection that you published in Nexus and also a website, both of which I'll link to at thevideoessay.com. So some folks may already be familiar with this, but for someone who is not, tell us about the introduction to the project, how long you worked on it, how it came into being, and a question that I have that I would like you just incorporate. How did you select your corpus? 148 films? I can't even imagine. So I see you smiling. Go ahead.
Well, that took a long time, but I'll come on to that. So just for people who don't know, the core of the project is it's a project around record playing in American independent cinema from 1987 till 2018, and as you say, it's a combination of writing and a number of video essays and also social media posts as well. So the project started, I would say it started in 2015. It stemmed really from a pre-existing interest I have in how pop music works in films. So my PhD back in the 20th century was on pop music in film, and also in American independent cinema. So a lot of the films that I've kind of written about in relation to pop music have been American independent films, but I've also taught courses on American independent cinema quite regularly over the last 20 years. So it was a way of kind of bringing those interests together. And I was interested in how kind of independent films made use of music in particular ways to reinforce their independent credentials. And one of the ways I'd noticed, and it's not just me that had noticed this, but one way that a number of American indie films seem to kind of use music was to feature record playing scenes as a kind of a sign of distinction for the films, just at a time when vinyl was actually becoming kind of an obsolete media, commercially speaking. So the kind of the more kind of the CD as it was came to dominate the sort of the kind of commercial music market, the more you saw scenes of characters playing records in American indie films as part of the kind of niche appeal of these films. So I observed that phenomenon, and I was just interested in kind of looking at it. And again, I suppose it was that kind of notion of thinking small again. So what could be smaller than a project that's based around looking at close-ups of kind of needles being placed on records. So started in 2015, and it had a written and a audiovisual component right from the start. So I wrote a chapter in a Palgrave handbook on sound design, which and I wrote a chapter about the kind of the sound of vinyl in the Royal Tenenbaums, Pulp Fiction, and Ghost World, and in the course of researching that and writing that chapter, I made my first supercut, which was my first attempt to just find as many examples as I could of this sort of kind of record playing scenes in American indie cinema. So that was kind of published in I think 2016, and the article came out in 2016 as well. So writing and the audiovisual components were hand in hand from the very start. And so that's how that was kind of the origins of it. And so I was interested in that kind of the research question, I suppose, at that time was to think about how does the kind of representation of vinyl in these films help to construct a sense of identity in these American independent movies. So that's a kind of sort of film specific kind of question. But then I thought about how I wanted to extend the project, and I thought, well, there might really be some kind of possibilities here in terms of inventing a project which also, as a key research question, was interested in thinking about the possibilities of the audiovisual form as a form of criticism, and I suppose academic criticism in particular. Because I guess what I was doing was I was looking at how films were depicting an analog medium, so taking vinyl as an analog medium, and by doing audiovisual criticism there, I was sort of using a digital form of criticism to investigate an analog representation. So I thought there might be an interesting crossover there between thinking of kind of audiovisual criticism as a digital form and written criticism as an analog form. And so I was also doing trying to think about the virtues of digital kind of forms of criticism versus written forms of or analog forms of criticism as well. So I thought there was maybe kind of a correspondence between the sort of the idea of looking at records in American independent cinema and thinking about audiovisual criticism as a digital form of investigation, moving on from kind of analog forms of investigation. And I suppose the other crossover was thinking about the record collector as a figure, the kind of the record collector figure that you get in these movies seemed potentially to resonate with the kind of the figure of the academic, the kind of the sort of the kind of the obsessive kind of qualities that you associate with the record collector, the kind of completism of the record collector, also kind of virtues that are associated with certain forms of academic research, that kind of desire to be completist and authoritative as well. So, I thought there might be kind of some nice kind of, associations between the kind of the representation of records in the films and thinking about what audiovisual criticism could do. In terms of the corpus of films and how I kind of built up that corpus, it really was just a matter of kind of lots of scanning films, and I suppose that is one of the interesting things about audiovisual criticism, particularly when you're doing research for kind of supercuts, is that if that completist urge does take over, then there's actually not enough time to watch all of these films or all of the possible films that could have record playing moments in their entirety. So you end up doing something which might seem like a cheat, which is kind of just scanning quickly as you can through a lot of movies, which is made possible through sort of digital technologies. I did do that, and the way I kind of sort of try to find leads on possible films was partly through my own kind of experience of kind of knowing the kind of directors that I knew had kind of featured record playing scenes in their films, and then just making sure I'd watched all of their filmographies, scanned through them to see if I'd missed anything. So it started off from that really, but then I would kind of use the Internet Movie Database to just do sort of, the keyword search, the advanced search function on Internet Movie Database is actually really useful in terms of sort of trying to find these scenes. Then I would also look through sort of box office lists of like independent kind of films in terms of box office across the years, and make sure I'd read the plot synopses, and if I felt it was likely there could be a record playing scene, I would try and kind of get hold of the film somehow and scan through it. And then just lots of other random scanning through any kind of thing that I was subscribed to, like Mubi or like BFI Player or whatever, or Amazon Prime and Netflix. I would just kind of just randomly scan as well. So I will have scanned through thousands of films. I didn't keep count of how many I'd scanned through to get to that 148. But it's not the sort of process that I would have adopted, if I was just doing written criticism. And a lot of my, my written work is really based on kind of just looking in detail at a very small number of things. So it was quite interesting to develop a different process for this.
This idea of the completist, I think, is fantastic. I also am a collector of things, not vinyl. So I definitely recognize that impulse, and it can be a blessing and a curse in a lot of ways. But to take a step back a bit, and I'll circle back to many of the things that you've just said in subsequent questions. But talking about relating a little bit to the completist, you published parts of this project as you finished them. And it's something that we've seen others do in projects, whether it's Once Upon a Screen, which we'll talk about in a little bit, publishing the videos and then on Vimeo as the creators made them, and then them all coming together in the Cinephiles, or I think of Jason Mattel's The Chemistry of Character in Breaking Bad. And the article you wrote for Nexus on this project was trying to think about Indy Vinyl as a monograph. Why did you decide to release it in parts before it all came together in the website and in the final article? And how did you know when one element of the project was ready for publication?
I think partly because I abandoned the idea of actually reproducing a monograph in audiovisual form, which, the traditional thing about a monograph isn't that you kind of release it bit by bit. Obviously, it's like you mull over it for a long time, you perfect it, then years later it's there, in book form, in some sort of perfect form. So if you looked at my plans for the project near the start, as I do talk about this in the Nexus article, I call it a sort of monographic mindset is a term that I use in the article. I definitely kind of had a monographic mindset from the start, in the sense I was planning the video essay very much as chapters in a book. And I don't know, I don't really know what happened to put me off that plan, apart from maybe just some of the things I said about kind of actually just becoming more influenced by things that were going on around me, and kind of getting out on social media and interacting there, and it just kind of encouraged me to work, use the phrase again, work in the flow more, and so if you look at the chapter plan I had for originally, it's nothing like what I ended up producing, but hopefully the project's more interesting as a result, and the kind of the shapes and sizes of the different elements are actually not uniform, and I think that's hopefully part of its charm, in a way. So I had to kind of unlearn some of my kind of academic habits in order to end up where I am now. And I think that's definitely something that Jason Patel and Kristen Keithley and Cary Grant in the videographic essay website, which is obviously kind of stems from the Middlebury College workshops. I think Kristen Keithley talks about kind of one of the intentions of the workshops is to get academics to unlearn their old habits. So I think my Indy Vinyl project was maybe an exercise in unlearning lots of things.
I love also how the website, as you say, there's a way that one could move through it, kind of like a monograph. But as you say, who knows how people are discovering things? Maybe they're just finding one of the videos on Vimeo, and then that leads them to the website, and then they play around, or they find the Nexus article, or they saw one of your social media posts. And again, it beautifully encaptures, as you say, the flow. You mentioned in the supercut, there's something in the supercut that mirrors that completist mentality. One thing that's interesting about the supercut is, and this is something that Alison Dufresne writes about in the Cinephiles, and just, I think the title of her essay is A Scholarly Approach to a Fanish Practice. And a lot of things to discuss on the supercut on, is a supercut a video essay? Why is some supercuts video essays, others aren't? When does it become one? A lot of things we could unpack there. But one thing that's interesting about the supercut is just, you kind of need to have a lot of examples. Otherwise you have, depending on the subject, a video that's 4 seconds or 12 seconds or what have you. Whereas in writing, perhaps if you're writing a book chapter, you might only need 3 or 4 or 5 examples, and that's really all you need. What drew you to the form of the supercut for this project?
The first impetus was what I said earlier about wanting to just try out a new form. So at the stage I made the first supercut in 2016, I still hadn't made that many video essays. I'd made the Hoagie Carmichael one, the voiceover one, and that was it actually. So this was my attempt at doing my supercut, and at that time I probably thought, okay, I'll only probably make one supercut again, so this is going to be it, but it didn't turn out that way at all. So just experimenting with a form I hadn't used before, that was one impetus. But in terms of the kind of the broader aims of the project, I thought using a supercut was it worked with the research I was doing into how record playing scenes help to construct a sense of identity for these movies. I thought producing a supercut which just compiled a lot of examples together would be doing that kind of scholarly work of providing evidence of the phenomenon, that this thing actually does exist, and it is a repetitive trope that you see across a number of movies. So I think I say in the Nexus article that the written equivalent would be the introduction to your kind of monograph, where you're just establishing what the corpus is, and the dimensions of it. So in one way it was serving that scholarly purpose by doing that. I wouldn't say it's part of a kind of research enterprise, but the actual supercut itself isn't really a kind of self-contained act of scholarship in that sense. So the thing that I think then, I'm not sure you asked me to talk about why supercuts are scholarly, but I suppose that's where I'm going with this.
That was going to be my next question. But before you get to that, let me just preface it quickly, and how I was thinking of it. So thank you for that. And I think, this is interesting in the sense that the supercut in and of itself is not scholarly, or maybe it is. We're gonna get to that. But I think it's important just to note, and this is what I was implying earlier if I didn't say it directly, and you make it clear, that it is, just from a labor and time standpoint, harder in many ways than how you might introduce it in the monograph, and the written monograph, as you say, where you might get away with limiting, you have 148 films, and you might get away there probably with 7-8 films. I don't know, I haven't written a book, but I think you know what I'm getting at. So just from a labor standpoint, it's a lot of work, but that itself doesn't necessarily make it scholarly. And you mentioned that on its own, it might not be scholarship. It's part of I think you just said scholarly enterprise. And in his response to the Once Upon a Screen videos that was also published in the Cinephiles, Kristen Keithley writes, of those videos, even if one were to claim that none of the accompanying videos qualifies individually as scholarship, I would argue that the collection of them surely begins to. I'm going to pass the baton over to you where you are going in a second, but I just want to preface it by saying that it seems this trend is becoming more common in videographic criticism, where there's a grouping of videos, whether made by one person or a group of people, and then together they become a scholarly enterprise, to use your phrase again, that I'm probably going to steal going forward. What do you make of this trend, and how do you see that applying to this work?
Yeah, well, I think the Once Upon a Screen collection is a fantastic example of that. I mean, it's a sort of a great idea, a great premise for kind of a call for video essays, and then to have Christian Keithley's kind of article sort of reflecting on the collection and tying them together as he does. I think it's just a perfect example of what you're saying, that actually kind of taken together, videos that on their own, you might or might not see as scholarly, certainly do become a very powerful kind of act of scholarship as a group. And I think, one thing maybe we'll talk about a bit later, one thing that I'm definitely want to do a lot more in the future is to do much more collaborative work. And so that's a form of collaboration in a way. It's kind of teaming up so that the kind of the whole has a greater force than the kind of the parts. In terms of my own work, definitely with the supercuts, the idea of producing more than one supercut was to make a comparison between them possible, which could then be seen as sort of an act of scholarship in itself. And one of the purposes of the Nexus article was to reinforce the notion of the collection of supercuts as a scholarly enterprise by reflecting on them in writing. So in the Nexus article, I didn't want to try and explain away the supercuts as if everything in them was planned to kind of have some kind of particular analytical purpose, because that's not how the supercuts work. But what I did want to do in the writing was to just give an example of how you could compare a moment from one supercut to another, and that might potentially give you a different kind of sort of critical insight into the body of films, in one supercut than you would get in the other one. And so through that act of comparison, you do begin to see the kind of potential of the supercut form to produce new knowledge, which is that would be in transitions kind of definition of what counts as scholarly. Although I know you had a really interesting discussion in your last kind of podcast with Tracy and Alison about in transitions definition of the scholarly is deliberately very kind of expansive and open-ended. So other kind of people will have different ideas, but that was certainly the idea there that through the comparison of the supercuts, you might see how they might produce knowledge differently, and that's an interesting thing to observe from a scholarly point of view.
Thank you for that. Yes, and we're recording this just a few days after I edited and released that episode into the world. So my conversation with Tracy and Allison is definitely rattling around my head here right now as we talk to you in a very important way. And it's interesting to hear you describe kind of the scholarly spark, I guess we could call it, that comes from watching these supercuts together. And it kind of reminds me of the way that we talk about one of the most well-known forms of videographic criticism, which would be kind of the side-by-side juxtaposition of two scenes. So it's interesting to then take that to the next level and think, okay, what happens when we watch two pieces of videographic criticism side by side?
Yeah, and I mean, one thing actually I was thinking of, I really should produce another supercut which actually puts all the 4 supercuts in the same frame to do that kind of side-by-side comparison. But I think maybe I've done enough with my supercuts. So
I would watch it. You have one viewer. That sounds like a great idea. The other video I was thinking was the way you talked about that you had an outline for the original monograph or whatever. I had in my mind the mind map that John Gibbs begins, say, have you seen the karaoke with? And he uses that. So maybe you can make a video essay on what Indy Vinyl was supposed to look like. But I assume you're probably 5 years working on the project. You don't want that. But anyway, that was my idea. I would watch that too.
All right, okay. I'll just do that one for you, Will.
Thank you. Speaking of reappropriating the work of others, because you reappropriated the conversation between me and John about his video essay for yours. See, it's all about the transitions here. You also featured audio from this podcast in one of the videos in Indy Vinyl. And early, I believe it was episode 6 or 7, my conversation with Jennifer Proctor, which feels like it took place forever ago. And it's a video that you call Indy Vinyl Interrupted that features Jennifer's answers to some of my questions in the podcast. Of this video, you write, quote, "The revelation of the corpus as a compromised one is only one intention of the video. It also literally centers the critical work that has been done to rethink the way we evaluate films and construct canons in the Me Too movement." Could you provide us with just an introduction in the Me Too context? Excuse me. Would you mind providing us an introduction to this video, how it came into being, and why you decided to include it in the project?
So I went through the process of making 4 different supercuts for the project, and I always knew that and the supercut is the form, I suppose, that is most associated with a kind of cinephilic response to films, and expressing that in an audiovisual format. So and I know Alison DeFriend talks about that in her article as well. So there is a kind of an association of the supercut with a very kind of uncritical approach to the object of study. The last supercut I made was really deliberately trying to be as ornate as possible. It's a one which has got a sort of multi-screen aesthetic, and it just has more kind of bells and whistles added to it as it goes on. So I was deliberately trying to make something by the end of the sort of supercut process that seemed almost ridiculously decorative in a way, and that's not a word you associate with scholarship. But the reason I wanted to kind of progress in that way and to end up with a supercut like that was I always knew that I wanted to undercut it somehow, to actually kind of just take a stop or to take a pause and say, okay, I seem to have got really really immersed in the form to an extent that maybe I'm losing any kind of sense of critical perspective, and to do that deliberately, and then in order to step back. So that I always had that in my mind. But I didn't know what form that would take. So really, it was with the moment of Me Too, as it did for many people, it really did make me sort of reevaluate what I was doing in quite a specific way. So there was a lot of talk, has been a lot of talk and continues to be, about how do you deal with kind of critically revered films once they've been contaminated in some way by the revelations about the sort of production process or about the people who were behind making those films. And that discussion seemed really pertinent in relation to contemporary American independent cinema, which formed my corpus. Obviously, given the kind of the association of Harvey Weinstein with the kind of American indie scene, but also more generally the notion of American independent cinema as an edgy, risk-taking kind of space, which kind of took on a different hue, I think, with the revelations through Me Too. So that made me feel that the way I wanted to reevaluate what I'd been doing with the supercuts and to undercut them was to reevaluate or to think about reevaluating the corpus in the light of Me Too. So the video itself, it takes that kind of last supercut, the really ornate kind of version of the supercut, and it deliberately sort of tries to disrupt the pleasure that you might get from it by every time it gets to a clip from a film that's associated with an abuser, then the video stops, and what comes up at that point is kind of a quote from someone who is doing the critical work of trying to reevaluate the canon in the light of Me Too. And what also comes up at those points is the audio of Jennifer Proctor talking on your podcast, and she's talking about a supercut that she made, Nothing But Soap and Water, which is it compiles clips of women in baths, and it's a brilliant video, and it's one that does that kind of work of trying to confront the misogyny in these kind of representations, that's doing that kind of the critical work that I think we all need to be doing, in terms of reevaluating the canon in the light of Me Too. So that's the background for why I wanted to make it in that form. And it was really serendipitous, I can't say that word, but the interview with Jennifer came out at the time it did, just as I was thinking about this video, because what I think her audio added was a kind of positive story of a kind of a filmmaker working in independent cinema who was actually kind of thinking about confronting misogyny through her work. So I like the idea of having that positive voice running through the video at the same time as the video was stopping to expose the kind of abuse that was behind the production of some of these films, and at the same time you were getting the sort of the positive critical work that was being done by many people in terms of like thinking about what do we do next in terms of how we approach a canon that has become contaminated in the way it has.
Well, thank you for that. And it's a great video, powerful video. Honored that the podcast could play a small role in Jennifer's commentary. It was a great interview, and her work is incredibly inspiring and great. And when I was learning video graphic criticism for the first time, it was in the fall of 2017. And one of my classmates, she was doing a video essay on American Beauty. And I think the day that we screened the first drafts of our essays, the night before that was when the Kevin Spacey news broke for the first time. And so we come to class the next day. Of course, she has a completed draft of this video essay. And I remember the discussion that day was not that her argument about American Beauty per se had to change because of it, but more thinking about how do we add to that? How do we incorporate these new revelations without it? Because I think one of the powerful things about videographic criticism is that because it gets released into the flow online, into the discourses, that it has to acknowledge, it doesn't have to, but oftentimes it would be weird if you didn't acknowledge it or incorporate it in some way. And I think that's a great thing. It's forcing people to do that. And it's not, I think it's something that I've come to appreciate more and more the more I've reflected on it and seen videos in that, you kind of have to be up on the times. You can't just ignore things anymore, And
I think one of the things that I think Alison maybe said on your podcast, she talked about I'm going to be misquoting Alison here, but something about kind of the potential of the supercut to connect with to be worldly in some way, to connect with the world, and maybe the attempt to do that is kind of is one of the potential of that form. And so I suppose that's exactly what I was trying to do with Indy Vinyl Interrupted, was to kind of try and come out of the sort of the cinephilic kind of celebration of these films, which might seem to be suggested by the way I kind of did the final supercut, and to really come out of that and re-engage the corpus with things that were actually happening in the world.
To segue again, you mentioned at the beginning that social media posts are also a part of your work and of Indy Vinyl, and also just your general creative process, your other videographic criticism. In the video Indy Vinyl on the Clock, you begin with a screenshot of your Twitter, or a screen recording of your Twitter, and that video was published in 2019. And I noticed that in that video, you only had a few hundred Twitter followers, and now you have well over 1,400 Twitter followers. And social media, as I said, played a role in this project. Could you talk about the role that social media played in Indy Vinyl specifically, but also how it aids your scholarship more generally? How do you use it? And we've already touched on that a little bit in this conversation, but I think it's just worth revisiting again here in the context of the project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I can't believe that you noticed that detail about my Twitter followers. You have been watching closely, so thanks very much for that. I mean, I think Indy Vinyl on the Clock, I mean, I've just produced these things over the last few years, and I get mixed up of when I actually produced when. But I think Indy Vinyl on the Clock, as you've noticed, was made, I guess, it was the first video I made that really deviated from the plan, actually. So it was really the kind of an example of a video that I made that was more working in the flow, and definitely that flow I was receiving was from my kind of immersion in social media, or bringing the project into the sort of social media world. So it definitely, the decision to use social media more as part of the project definitely did influence the kind of things I ended up making. So actually both in Indy Vinyl on the Clock, but also Indy Vinyl Interrupted as well. So the other element to Indy Vinyl Interrupted, the kind of the information I get about the kind of about the abusers is from a website called Rotten Apples, which kind of is like a database where you can kind of put a film in, and it'll kind of tell you if anyone involved in the making of the film has been accused of abuse. So by just kind of becoming immersed in that sort of online world, that definitely started to kind of influence the kind of videos I was making for the project. So Indy Vinyl on the Clock was really the first one to be influenced by kind of me becoming more immersed in that world. But it's more generally in terms of how social media has shaped my research, that in the Nexus article, I talk about the social media posts that I've made as kind of research fragments. I don't really make great claims for them as fully developed acts of scholarship, but I certainly do like the format of Twitter, in a way, the kind of constraining format of Twitter, in terms of trying to produce sort of something interesting, some interesting thought about a moment from one of my films. In that format, I think it's an interesting exercise, and then it has the obvious kind of sociable aspects to it. It can lead to engagement with people that wouldn't otherwise be engaged with this kind of work. It can lead to interesting conversations, so it's got that aspect as well. And I hope they kind of fit quite well with the sort of the record playing conceit. On the website, I include some examples of my social media posts, and I call them that section I call sleeve notes. So that's the kind of spirit I see them in, really, as kind of like little fragments that accompany the kind of the main body of work, and try and work interestingly within the sort of social media formats. So I actually started off on Instagram trying to do these sort of kind of little sort of postcard kind of style things about each record playing moment from each film. So it'd be like a card which would have a kind of a still image of the record playing moment. Then it would kind of say who the kind of the artist was who you were hearing at that time, a little bit about the narrative situation, what the name of the song was, what the genre of the film was, that kind of thing. So it started off on Instagram, but I didn't really get on with Instagram in terms of kind of understanding how it worked. So I went over to Twitter, and I found actually, I suppose maybe it's kind of reflects my ambition to kind of combine writing and audiovisual in the project. I found the ability to kind of write on Twitter as well as kind of produce images or kind of clips much more in keeping with what I wanted to do with the project as a whole. So I think there's a real kind of potential for social media to be used for research, but obviously that's something I think you're doing actually in a much more organised way with your Rio Bravo kind of project than I've done.
Well, certainly I have a long way to go on Rio Bravo Diary to get it anywhere near as great a project as Indy Vinyl, but I'll take any slight comparison I can get. And always good to hear of the benefits of social media. There are certainly a lot of negatives to it. But
I'm in the fortunate position, really, that I'm not beholden to social media, and actually I've been pretty quiet on Twitter recently, and I don't really do any other social media properly apart from Twitter. So it's obviously. Some people really kind of rely on social media, in order to kind of publicize their work, and they need it for various reasons. I'm in the fortunate position of being in a full-time academic kind of job and being around. I'm able to play around with different formats, and I do kind of appreciate that, and I hopefully don't take it for granted.
No, that does make a lot of sense, especially as social media these days is, for so many people, is having to sell their personal brand. So it's definitely nice to see some content that's not that now and again. But speaking of the internet and how we use it, I think that's a good time to transition to the final part of our conversation. And again, this is just meant to highlight a work that you find particularly compelling. We're never able to dive fully into these works in the way that we should, but this is also where I kind of turn the mic over to you, and that is asking you to introduce the video essay that you've selected for us to discuss.
Yeah, so the video I selected is My Mulholland by Jessica McGoff, and it's part of the Once Upon a Screen collection that we've been talking about. So as I said, I think we said before, the premise of this collection is that each of the videos looks at a kind of a formative moment in the creator of the video's filmmaking experience, some kind of disturbing moment. And so Jessica McGoff chooses the moment when she watched Mulholland Drive for the first time as I think as a 13-year-old, and couldn't get through it because she kind of comes to a moment that she finds too scary and has to stop. She just tells a great story about what led up to her watching Mulholland Drive, and her kind of position as a teenager, kind of consuming kind of media in an online world. I think it's 2007, I think is kind of the time she watched it. So she talks about what it was like to be a 13-year-old on the internet at that time, and a sort of a budding cinephile as well, and the opportunities that the internet allowed to kind of discover new movies, but also the kind of the constraints of the internet and the kind of the dangers of the internet as well. But it's just one of the reasons I chose it is simply just because I think it's a great film, and it just tells its story in a really compelling way. It draws you in, and like the timing, I think the timing is just great in various moments. So I was laughing at various points, and there's a moment where Jessie reenacts watching a sort of a screamer video, one of these sort of prank videos that has this suddenly really disturbing bit in what you think is going to be an innocuous video clip. So she reenacts her teenage self doing that, and like I really jumped at that moment as well. So it kind of does the thing that again that Christian Keithley has talked about, is that one of the great advantages of the audiovisual form is that you are kind of making a film, and you're using all the kind of expressive devices of filmmaking to do that. I think it really does it really successfully. I think then, as well as telling a personal story, it's also a video which does kind of say something about the history of the internet, and is really specific about what was going on in the internet in 2007. And really recreates that in a really effective way, and makes you appreciate that, of the internet, the online world is a constantly evolving phenomenon, rather than just thinking of it as something kind of static, which I think is certainly something that maybe I sometimes do, is not really appreciate how things have changed, on the internet. But then in the last part of the video, it kind of expands it out of Jessie's personal experience of internet culture into a really kind of thought-provoking discussion about our responsibilities in terms of how the internet has now evolved, with the kind of the sort of like the image culture that has kind of proliferated through the internet, and what our responsibilities are in dealing with that. And by our responsibilities, I think Jessie is kind of talking partly about people who make video essays like her. So in the end, it becomes a really interesting video essay about making video essays, which is not how I thought it was going to be when it starts out.
I will say a couple of things. One is that so Jessie and I are around the same age, I believe, if I'm looking at the timeline correctly. And the jump scare video that she uses, which ends with an image from The Exorcist, I believe. Like, I remember watching that around the same age, and it was very much, as I believe she describes in the video, like your friend would come up, like, the internet. I remember sitting when people had computer cabinets, they used to have those, like going to a friend's computer cabinet and sitting in front of it and being like, hey, watch this video, and then the jump scare. So on a personal level, I had a lot of things feeling. I was not watching David Lynch when I was 13, so that's impressive that she was even attempting that to begin with. But for what you say about how it is a film, I absolutely felt that the same way. This phrase desktop documentary is an interesting one, which is exactly what it is. I think there's a sense out there that the documentary part of the desktop documentary phrase, I think sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, in that recording one's desktop, I don't think makes it a desktop documentary, right? Like incorporating desktop recording is an element that we might associate with the form of desktop documentary, and it's a formal choice that the video essayist makes, but that doesn't make it a desktop documentary. I'm saying that phrase over and over again, but I think it's relevant here. And that, as you say, I felt like it was a mini film, and there were parts where I thought it was going to end, but then it kept going and it kept getting deeper and more complex. Like you could imagine certain parts where it could have ended and you'd think, okay, well, that was an interesting piece of film analysis, but then we go a layer deeper and it gets broader and wider. And I think it's a really great example of why choosing the desktop documentary form, it has to fit what the video is trying to accomplish, right? Like on one level, it has to, I think, somehow incorporate the internet, right? And on the other, it needs to tell you a story in that way and to move through the device. At least, I'm not saying it has to be, but I think the successful examples, that's something that I would find in the genre.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think the control of that sort of desktop documentary format in My Mulholland is really truly impressive. And I mean, again, that's something I've found teaching video essays. More and more students are wanting to incorporate that sort of desktop aesthetic into their videos, and it's actually really quite difficult to to tell a compelling story using that format. I think it's probably a lot more difficult than people think it's going to be. And so the way that Jessie kind of stages the story through its different phases using the desktop format, I think is a really impressive kind of, again, filmmaking feat. And there's something really something really clean and clear about the way that she's using that desktop form, which I think helps to actually to lift the sort of the personal story that she's telling into something that has a kind of a sort of a wider significance, because you don't immediately see some sort of cluttered desktop and then that's just randomly being recorded. Everything there seems to be placed quite particularly for a specific reason in order to kind of investigate a phenomenon, whether it's to do with the kind of how the internet worked in 2007 or as it progresses, thinking kind of about more contemporary issues. Whatever it's trying to do, it seems to kind of move its materials in a very precise way in order to investigate a particular phenomenon.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I appreciated, and maybe perhaps something I wouldn't have noticed unless I rewatched it today in preparation for this conversation. So I was perhaps overly focused on looking at form and how it was constructed. But I appreciated how there were times where Jessie actually takes us out of the desktop, in particular when the video essay is kind of perhaps doing something a little more traditional is not the right word. But, when we're just doing, film analysis of Mulholland Drive, we aren't in the desktop. It's just the film clips and it's annotated and it's kind of the more usual video essay format. But then when we go to the desktop is when it's getting perhaps a little bit more personal, or maybe personal is not the right word. Maybe it's a little more focused on the internet in that personal narrative, which I thought was a very good way of making clear what was what and walking us through the story, which I really appreciated. And it goes to show that the desktop documentary doesn't always need to be so rigid in that we're on the desktop all the time and we're creating this illusion that I'm actually there. It can be a mix of different forms.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right about how the video uses Mulholland Drive in the sense, to start with, Mulholland Drive and the references to Mulholland Drive are incorporated in that desktop style, that reconstruction of Jessie's experience. But then, as you say, you get into a passage which is more like a kind of sort of film analysis, kind of explanatory kind of style of analysis. And then that's used as a bridge to then kind of to use Mulholland Drive in the latter part of the video in a much sort of meta kind of textual way, and so Mulholland Drive is being used in at least 3 different ways through the video, and each way it's being used there's a different form associated with its use at different points. So it's really has got that really kind of precise demarcations between sections, I think, while still having a really kind of lovely flow. So Mulholland Drive kind of creates the common link between all the different sections.
The other thing I appreciated there's so many layers to this video, but just the way also it had me thinking about canons and lists and, what's important, or in heavy quotes, and thinking about how much of movie going is informed, especially at the beginning of one's, when one has decided, okay, I love film, I'm going to commit myself to this. Where do I go? Especially for someone who grew up on the internet with access to, again, not everything, but so many things. It can be really overwhelming to know where to start, and which can lead you to watching David Lynch when you're 13, because you really don't know how to negotiate those things, especially, as Jessie says, that she was often alone on the internet navigating this herself. And I think in that sense, it really has one questioning the canon, but also is a really great account of what it's like to be a cinephile now and the challenges that come with it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And it kind of does present the internet in 2007, that kind of Wild West sort of feeling around the internet at that point, full of possibilities, but also kind of an unknown kind of space as well. And I suppose maybe what Jessie is sort of representing there in terms of cinephilia in 2007 is what you were talking about, the kind of feeling a little bit at a loss, knowing where to look for video essays kind of now. So that there's maybe, again, I don't know if that's sort of an equivalence that's being kind of made by Jessie in My Mulholland, but it's something that's just coming up in our discussion now. But again, that's why I think that the video is really interesting to think of as kind of a reflection on where we are in terms of kind of making video essays, as much as it is of her experience of kind of trying to deal with the internet 13 years ago.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about as I watched it, because I didn't discover my love of film until I was in college, and at that point I could just take courses and people would curate screenings for me and I would find things to watch. So it was pretty easy. But in a sense also, I'm thinking that video essays can also point us towards those underseen films, those films that we should discover, that video essays can reach, maybe not 13-year-olds, but I'm sure there are plenty of 13-year-olds who watch video essays, but really anyone of any age, and can then help us be spectators and be watchers. And something I think about, I'm someone who's made a ton of Hitchcock video essays, and I'll be the first to admit that we probably don't need more video essays about Hitchcock. I'm probably going to make more, but I have complicated feelings about it. But, it's that kind of thing of thinking about as you say, our own role as video essayists and what images we continue to reappropriate, to pump out there, to put to the top of the pile, and to keep going. I think it does a great job in forcing us to not forcing us, but asking us to contemplate those questions.
Yeah, and I think I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think then that does make it a great complement to some of the articles that were in the Cinephiles special issue as well. Which are like the one by Susan Harewood, and Lauren Berliner, which are kind of really questioning kind of what it is we're doing when we're playing with the archive. So it's a great audiovisual companion piece in the way you're describing it there to those articles as well.
And I'm not sure when our conversation will be released, but I've recently recorded a conversation for On Your Screen, which is the new companion show to the Video Essay podcast with Kaylin Meadows, who's a student at Ithaca College and who made a great video essay on the rise of film TikTok, in which we talk about film TikTok for those who may not be familiar like myself. And there's a trend on film TikTok of people recording videos of themselves discovering great films for the first time. And, sometimes I've seen people mock young teenagers, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds who may be like, oh, you have to go check out this film. It's so sick, blah, blah, blah. And then it's, Shawshank Redemption or, something like, or, Citizen Kane or something like that, And I always think to myself, instead of mocking these people, we should be excited that they are interested in film, and then trying to point them in the right direction. And so I think now we're seeing not only are people, there are always people who are 13 years old or whatever who are interested in film, but now they're more visible. We see their faces. They don't need to hide behind an IMDb message board like Jesse does in this video, which also shows something about how the internet has changed. But I think it also shows to be aware of audience, and that there are young people who are interested in film and moving images and culture that are definitely consuming our content right now, because it's so much more common now for a 13-year-old to just have an iPad and be on YouTube all day, that perhaps we should be more aware of that and thinking through how we are addressing a wider range of audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the kind of the great appeals of making video essays is, as we've already said, you can make them and then you can just put them online. Like many academics, my work goes on Vimeo, and it doesn't get thousands of views. So there's an extent to which I know I'm putting my work out there for a fairly kind of closed circuit, in a way. But even within that context, I'm always really glad to hear when for instance, when Sydney Wild Harris really kind of generously talked about the video I made, Slap That Bass Zoomed, in your podcast, and she was talking about the way that she's sort of shown it to friends that weren't necessarily interested in Fred Astaire movies from the 30s, and they'd really got something out of it. It's great that kind of even my kind of videos, which are made in a very kind of academic context, have a limited viewership. Even those do kind of break out to kind of different audiences as well. And I suppose when I started the Indy Vinyl project, I thought one idea I had maybe this will be kind of a project that could have that crossover appeal, because just of the nature of the subject, and it might have that sort of kind of vinyl fans being interested in it as well. It's not really worked out that well in terms of kind of number of kind of views in that way. So I've got no idea. If students ask me for advice on how to kind of make a viral video, I don't have a clue at all. But I'm just very grateful if for anyone that watches my videos. But it is really nice to kind of know that there might potentially be people watching them that wouldn't normally kind of be touched by what I do in my written work, for example.
No, absolutely. And you never know. You never know. Maybe, maybe I don't know. I could see some music publication eventually sometimes stumbling upon this and writing an article or doing an interview with you, or you writing an op-ed. I think I could see that down the road in the future. Who knows what it will bring? And I think that just goes back to the power of the form, is that, it's kind of similar to Cary Grant. It can be a serious form of study, but at the end of the day, you have to reckon with the fact that you're putting these out into the public. And if you want people to stumble upon them and enjoy them and what have you, then you have to make sure that you have that audience in mind. So, and I think that that's its benefit. That's its strength. Final question for you here, wrapping up our conversation and going back to where we began, which is your interest in videographic criticism as a teacher. I believe Jesse was a student of yours and was at the University of Glasgow. And Jesse, I would say, is absolutely a leading video essayist and someone whose work I admire and a lot of people admire. So I guess from a teaching standpoint, what was it like for you to watch this video and to see the great work that she's made?
Well, it's absolutely great to see what Jessie is doing. I take no credit for it at all. I mean, I think she actually was a student on the first iteration of the video essay course. So the first time I taught a video essay course at Glasgow, and she did the great video on Bronson, which was taken up by IndieWire, and got quite a few different articles written about it, and it was a really successful video out of the course. But I didn't have much to do with its development. I think I was the convener of the course that gave her first opportunity to make a video essay. So I guess I'll take that credit. But really, she came with an idea that was really fully formed, and she's just gone on from strength to strength. So, but that is definitely one of the kind of advantages of this format, is the potential for students to make something for a course, to put it online, and then to see what happens, in a way that just students don't think to do with written work. And so, a more recent example, and the last time I did the video essay course, the one where you came to talk to the students, a student did a really great video essay on the gays in Barry Jenkins' movies. She put it online, and then Matt Zoller Seitz obviously watched it and kind of posted something very complimentary on Twitter about it. So it's really nice that students have the opportunity to have their work kind of seen instantly in that way, and that's definitely one of the kind of benefits of teaching these kind of courses.
Absolutely. I and you and this podcast are big proponents of student work. Some of the best work out there is by students, no question. And I think a great way to end, and that has been a theme for this episode, is that make video essays, put them out into the world, and some good things will happen. And they won't happen until they're published and sent out for the public consumption. Ian Garwood, it has been an absolute pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for joining me, for all you do, for your support, and taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, thanks, Will. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks again for inviting me.